Welcome to my presentation. In this podcast, I'd like to talk about the situation and the controversies around foreign language teaching in Switzerland. What languages are taught in which order varies a lot throughout the country, and I'd like to examine why that's the case and what some of the consequences are. For this, I will first explain the situation of Switzerland around its languages and its education system. Then I will show what has happened around foreign language teaching in the last 40 years or so, and show what the situation is now. Then I will talk about the controversy around the order of second and third language teaching and draw a short conclusion. In the end, you will find my figures and references. First to the situation. It's a well-known fact that Switzerland is home to 4 official languages. Most people speak German, followed by French and Italian, and a small minority speaks Romansh. Way more present than Romansh are various immigrant languages. They're not a subject of this presentation, but they're worth a mention, I think. Well, to see how the language situation is managed, we first need to look at the Swiss Constitution. In Article 70 that concerns itself with languages, it is said that the cantons are the ones who decide on their official languages, and in their decision they have to respect traditional territorial distributions of languages and indigenous linguistic minorities. So, as a consequence of this, the way in which an official language is determined within a canton underlies the principle of territoriality. This means that, with a few exceptions, at each point of the territory of Switzerland there is only one official language. According to Grin and Korf, this means that even in bilingual cantons, public services are only available in one language, the official one of that particular territory. And as a consequence, there are stable language boundaries, as they call it. So they run right through some cantons and are quite stable over several centuries even. So here you can see what territoriality basically looks like. This map doesn't show the official language of each community, but the most present language, so there might be some difference. But usually the official language is the one that is spoken by most people in that territory, as it would make sense. So, what are the consequences for language education in Switzerland? Grin and Korf summarize that both official language and education are matters of the canton. The principle of territoriality leads to language boundaries even within some cantons. As we know, there are bilingual cantons, even a trilingual one. And as a consequence, foreign language education in different cantons varies almost by definition and is difficult to coordinate. It's still, of course, in the interest of the state and also of the cantons to have some sort of coordination within one state when it comes to education. And this is where the EDK comes in. The Standing Conference of Cantonal Education Ministers, as its full English name is, regularly issues recommendations and tries to find agreements between the cantons to harmonize education in Switzerland. So this is all done by recommendations rather than laws, because it's really the business of a canton what its education in the end looks like. But in the past 40 years, the EDK have been heavily involved in foreign language policies. So then let's look at those past 40 years. The first time the EDK issued a recommendation on foreign language teaching was in 1975. The main points were that a second national language, L2, should be compulsory for all students, and that this language should be German for French-speaking parts of Switzerland, and French for German and Italian-speaking parts of Switzerland. Grisons, with its special situation as a trilingual canton, was an exception already then, and there was no possibility to choose between L2 and English. In fact, English was mainly an optional subject in or even after secondary level 1. In the 80s, the cantons followed this recommendation, and an L2 was mainly taught in secondary school. But the language performances were what Grin and Cole call disappointing, and some of the cantons started to introduce the L2 earlier as a consequence, usually in grade 5. At the same time, English was gaining more and more importance, and people started to get worried that it might not be a big enough part of the curriculum. So some cantons, but by far not all, introduced English as a compulsory L3. This situation mainly stayed the same until 1998, when the EDK issued the general concept of language teaching. It's not the same as a recommendation like in 1975. It's not that formal, but it had important points that had quite heavy implications on the future of foreign language education, and in fact some of them are still in our current systems. It said that 2 foreign languages should be compulsory, and English should be one of them. And the other one should be a national language, and if possible, other languages should be offered as well as optional subjects later. What was also new is that this concept left it to the cantons to decide which language they would choose first or introduce first, the national one or the English one. The only condition actually was that in the end of compulsory education, the students should be on the same level in both languages. Based on this 1998 concept, the EDK issued a new recommendation in 2004. Those are largely the ones that are being followed now. The recommendation says that the 2 compulsory foreign languages are to be taught in primary school. The optional third one has to be offered in secondary school, and again, there's no specific order that is recommended. The cantons have followed these recommendations and have integrated them in agreements and curricula. There is, for example, the Intercantonal Agreement on the Harmonization of Compulsory Education, which is more famous under its short name HARMO-S. This wants to harmonize compulsory level education on a national level, as the name implies, and it works with national educational standards and regional curricula, like, for example, the Lehrplan 21 in German-speaking parts and the Plan d'études roman in French-speaking parts. Those curricula are now in place in most parts of Switzerland, and they have integrated the recommendations of 2004, so that now L2 is taught from HARMO-S Year 5, which is actually grade 3 because HARMO-S starts from preschool, and L3 is taught from HARMO-S Year 7, which is grade 5. So now the two languages are being taught on primary level. But, as mentioned before, the cantons are free to choose which language they want to introduce first. On this map you can see how they have decided. Generally, the French and Italian speaking parts choose to start with the national language, and as do those German cantons that are either bilingual or close to language borders. Those either bilingual or close to language border cantons that have decided to start with a national language, namely French, work together in a collaboration called Passepartout. They're the cantons Bern, Fribourg, the two Basel, Solothurn and Valais. Next to them being close to French-speaking regions, the arguments for their choice are that, for one, a playful approach is more beneficial to French learning, because they say that French, the language, presents more formal difficulty. So these difficulties might discourage students from putting effort in learning French. So if they do it playfully, they might be more enthusiastic about it. So they basically argue that enthusiasm is more difficult to achieve for French. And they also say that younger children are not as influenced by English culture as older children, which makes sense to a part, because older children probably listen to more English music and try to understand it, and movies and games and such. And also they do believe that a good level of English is easier to achieve because it's more a part of everyday life. So basically they say that the children learn English as they get along. So that's why they choose to start with French. But if we go back to the map, we can see that the Passepartout cantons are the only German-speaking or partly German-speaking cantons of Switzerland who start with a national language, the exception being Graubünden. Central and Eastern Switzerland all start with English, and it might not seem like it at first glance, but those are actually 14 cantons. So it's more than half of the cantons that don't start with a national language, and it's the vast majority of German-speaking cantons. This has sparked some discussion about the status of English versus that of the national languages, particularly that of the national languages that are not German. And Grin and Korf therefore point out that it generally seems to be the case that it's the non-German speaking parts that are concerned about this development towards English, while German parts are either in favor of it or not really bothered by it. So I went on an online newspaper research and I found a few headlines that concern themselves with these language controversies. Those are all quite recent, so from within the past 2 years, and I took them from very different papers, like some are from the NZZ and others are from the 20 Minuten. But they all show how political and how kind of heated the question of foreign language education is in the end. And it seems particularly so between the French and the German speaking part of Switzerland. So it seems to be, at least in the papers, it seems to be a lot of controversy, French versus German, and French versus English at the same time. And now there's even more controversies, because some people already speak of only teaching English at primary school level, as one of the NZZ papers you will find in my references shows. And so the French-speaking part of Switzerland fears for its status. But even without that only English at primary school discussion, the order in which foreign languages should be introduced is debated vividly. So I'm now going to present the two sides of it, or their argumentation. So those who favor a national language as L2 argue that national languages are of cultural relevance to Swiss students. Similarly, it's a matter of national unity and identity. Grin and Korf point out that the connection of four languages is what sets Switzerland apart from the surrounding countries with the same languages. The national languages are part of what makes Switzerland Switzerland, which kind of makes sense. Furthermore, those in favor of a national L2 argue that putting English before a national L2 is a part of this drift towards the excessive use of English, and they argue that this excessive use of English, or this drift towards English, happens largely at the expense of national languages. And they also see, because of that, they see language minorities of Switzerland in danger. Opposed to this, those in favor of English see it simply as the more popular choice. People want to learn English, and they want to learn English because it's linked to opportunity and seen as more relevant nowadays. And as a consequence, those who are for English, they fear that if you give priority to national languages, wealthy parents might actually pay for private lessons in English for their children. And so equal opportunities for all children might be in danger. Similarly, they also see English as the language of globalization, and if Switzerland wants to be a part in this globalized world, which is for many reasons desirable, they have to learn the language of this globalization. And they also argue against the argument that language minorities are in danger because of English, because they say that a national language, the second national language, usually means French. So children aren't taught Italian or Romansh largely at school, but French, and French isn't a minority language. It's the second most spoken language in Switzerland. So all in all, this national language versus English can probably be brought down to cultural value versus economic value. Both sides do present good arguments, as most of the author's features in my presentation conclude, and they both have a point, they both have valid points. But I think one also has to keep in mind that the goal of compulsory education, as stated before, is still that in the end students have the same level in English and the national foreign language. So this debate makes it seem like it's a question of which language is more important to learn, whereas if you look at the goals, it seems like it should be a question of which language would make more sense to start with, so we end up at the same point in the end. So as a conclusion, we can say that this linguistic and political situation with territoriality and the different language regions and their needs and the federal principle that the cantons are the ones to decide in the end what to do, they do complicate the Swiss school system. And as a consequence, harmonization is achieved through recommendations and agreements rather than laws, because so the different regions can fit foreign language education to their needs. The different orders of foreign language teaching that those regions and the cantons decide on spark controversial debates that are often more politically linked to the idea of what's best for the country, or what keeps us together, or what's culturally valuable and what's economically valuable, rather than education as such. So yes, that's basically the end. This is where my pictures are from, and these are my references, and have a nice day and goodbye.